Transcendendo a ruptura espacial rural-urbana. Práticas insurgentes refazendo o espaço, a raça e as trajetórias alternativas da modernidade. A ideia então é ouvi-lo entre 25 minutos e abrir para rodadas de perguntas, certo? Então, eu vou estar aqui na moderação e depois eu vou fazer um breve comentário após a sua apresentação.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you for everyone. I'm hearing myself. Wondering what the school. Yeah, I want to. This earlier session was very important to begin to lay a good foundation for my own discussion. Thinking about how we think about the rural-urban spatial rift and also the interconnection between those two. So my title is thinking through how insurgent practices are remaking space, race, and an alternative trajectory of modernity. And I will talk a little bit about that. So, I want to start off by characterizing the South African society as it is now, so-called post-apartheid, and one can argue that the fundamental pillars of the apartheid capitalist system is still intact. In essence, what we have is a post-apartheid South Africa that is built on the material basis of racism and capitalism. What some scholars characterize as neoliberal apartheid or the new liberalization of racism and capitalism in the current conjuncture. Now, we can think about in terms of land and income inequality persists. The state is pursuing its continued failed market-based land reform. In terms of agricultural land, it's still almost 70% is still in the hands of the white population. About 5,000 farmers and agribusiness still controls large tracts of the land. Now, think about liberation. You have a population of 60 million people. 9 million are white. Now you can think about the disproportionate ownership structure that is still intact. I said I would record myself, time myself. Sorry. Anyways, you will tell me when it's 2 hours. So, the fundamental basis and the economic power is still intact. The small white elite still controls the entire base of the economy. Even though we have this idea that there is a post-apartheid South Africa and we have freedom. So, as Lynn has said, there's a massive explosion of unemployment in South Africa. I think even we are at levels of 32% unemployment. And in terms of spatial geography, it is still structured along race, ethnicity, and class, right? And it's an important point just to explain how the apartheid racial classification scheme works in South Africa. So, on top, you have whites who are descendants of the Dutch, the British, and those were the two countries that colonized South Africa, particularly the Dutch in the early. Historically, they didn't make it. So it's important to understand how the classification scheme works. Second, and this is all in terms of hierarchy and privilege and its space. Second, you have Indians that were brought as indentured laborers. Third, you have a category that is ambiguous because it's called colored people. But the idea is that colored people are supposed to be of mixed race. But that's a myth because we had a period of slavery. So the descendants of slaves from Mozambique, West African, small population, people from Indonesia, all are clustered in this idea of color, including the indigenous people on the white side. So there's this myth about color being descendants of mixed race. Even historically, some other groups that were, and then you have what people classify the African majority. But during the period of apartheid, people were able to have mobility both ways. So those who are light in complexion could reclassify themselves as white, and some who were so-called Africans. I use so-called Africans in the sense because it obscures more than what it reveals in terms of the classification schema. So those people could reclassify themselves as colored. So sociolinguistics sort of determines identity in a large measure, right? And I think that's just important for me to clarify how the system works and how it fractions. So you had race, right? But blackness is not the only mechanism that the colonialists or the apartheid or the capitalist system use. It fractures the black population further through ethnic divisions, right? And it's important for us to understand. So just to clarify my point earlier or yesterday, so when I talk about the emergence of political blackness, it is precisely to have countered these ethnic divisions amongst the black population and to unite all oppressed groups under the singular positive term of blackness, right? So I just want to read the way in which Steve Biko defined blackness. Is blacks are those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, and socially discriminated against as a group in South Africa, identifying themselves as a unit in the struggle towards the realization of their aspiration. Being black is not a matter of pigmentation, being black is a reflection of a mental attitude. So it's about struggling against the oppressive system, understanding that in order to address it, we have to think about political means to sort of fight the system. So all of these are just by way of background and to explain the dynamics to get to my single point. So fast forward, we are in a post-apartheid South Africa. We're supposed to have democracy. We have the right to vote, but the fundamental basis of society is still intact, right? And this is the background in which one has to begin to understand this dynamic. Now, what I'm going to talk about is based on ethnography that I did in the city of Cape Town, and it provides us a lens to think through how do you solve the settler colonial question, right? Even though you have democracy, even though you have a black government, what is the pillars of making settler colonialism intact? And I would argue that the fundamental basis is landlessness, is a mechanism that maintains and keeps settler colonialism intact. And until we resolve the land question or the agrarian question, settler colonialism will continue to have a stranglehold on the population, even though we have a black majority. So, what I want to start off by thinking about this problematic of rural-urban, because the urban in capitalist modernity is sort of seen as the height of modernity. That urbanization is the space in which you characterize the degree of modernity. So the more urbanized you are, the more you have been able to sort of extricate yourself from past or rurality, and so this is what I'm trying to think through and to sort of begin for us to challenge this understanding of what is urban and what is rural. And this idea emerged from unilinear conceptions of urban space, which take the urban as a structural space and not as a social relation, right? But what if we think about the way in which space are constituted through social relations and material practices, as much as social relations are also spatially structured, right? And so once we begin to understand this, we can think about it through, this idea of combined and uneven development in cities and how it is creating existing explosive tensions and occasional rebellions in the case of South Africa. So when I talk about how to think about transcending the spatial rift, I'm thinking it through the lens of the way in which insurgent practices are constituting new social relations within the city, right? And I will talk about what is the implication of thinking through this problematic, right? Because we are told that the processes of class formation, and here I want to put the idea of settler colonialism on the one hand, and its self-representation, and processes of what Western Marxism regards as processes of class formation. Now, in Western Marxism, there's the idea that commodity relations sort of renders the land question obsolete. So the more capitalist relations you have, they tell us that no, everything is capitalist, so there is no agrarian question. Now, some of us from settler colonialism, it blows our mind because we are asking now, oh, okay, so there is capitalist relations in the countryside, so does it mean we have to leave it intact? Because this is the idea, because capitalism has brought the technology and the ways of being that we can take over and sort of build something new. And so this idea is to begin to think about how do we disrupt this self-representation of capitalist modernity and think about it through the coexistence of different temporalities. So we can think about it as space as a geological layer. So the question is, what happens to dispossessed rural classes when they enter into the urban domain, right? And how are they sort of contesting, and is capitalist relation, commodity relations, the primary basis on which people then think about land? I would suggest no, that is not the primary basis. To give you a concrete example, our neighbor in the north, Zimbabwe, another settler colonial society that were colonized by the Rhodesians, the British, had fully capitalist agricultural relations. First, they had the 1980 freedom. Bob Marley came and performed there. Everyone came. Almost 20 years, 10 years later, there was a revolt in Zimbabwe, and people then occupied land and changed the entire land relations of the countryside. Of course, there are a lot of some issues, but the primary problem, it is only once they resolved the land question by which emerged from below that they were able to resolve the settler colonial question, the first element of the settler colonial question, right? And I will come back to that once you do that, you will sort of come up against a global racialized order that wants to undermine that. And there's historical precedent between what is happening in settler colonial society in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and which go back even to the Haitian Revolution. Because there's retribution for oppressed groups once they dare to resolve the land question. The rest of capitalist racial order will respond in different ways. So Haiti is the image that Zimbabwe is now. Zimbabweans are 21st century Haiti because they dare to take land from the settlers, and the settlers are demanding compensation. In the same way, when the Haitians took over and liberated themselves, France and others demanded reparation. And so this is the contradictory space that we find ourselves in. I guess I have still 9 hours. So for me, it's to think about what scholars have characterized as insurgent practices. That where does theory emanate from? And for me, where my starting point is to look at those insurgent practices of people outside of the domain that we normally don't think about, and how they can begin to shape our own theoretical understanding. So, which is a new subject, historical subject that emerged that can sort of shape our understanding. And for me, the starting point is, and maybe Haiti is not the only one, but I'm thinking of it through the lens of these insurgent practices and how we can begin to shape theory and think about emancipatory alternatives. Because what is the consequence if we accept that the insurgent Haitians is the model for us to think about emancipation, but also understand that the consequences. And for me, that is the model that the Haitians did and the Zimbabweans did. They dared to stand up and took the land by means. It was not a peaceful process, it was a violent process. But because of organization and it forces the state to sort of intervene, that process sort of emerged itself. So I'm thinking about how we can begin to think about a new form. So within the apparatus of the city, my project is looking at how in the urban space, dispossessed people, when they come to the city, are engaging in a new process of the politics of what I call the politics of repossession. So once they are, and I'm using this as looking at through the lens of the city of Cape Town, which is one of the most developed cities. It presents itself as a world-class city where you can come to the beaches like Rio and others. What we are seeing, what is emerging there is a politics of repossession from below, where people are dispossessed in one locale, but once they contest space in another locale. So how is this emerging? I'm arguing that because of the combined process of the history of past racial dispossession and the contemporary failures of neoliberalism gives rise to a politics of repossession in the 21st century. Combined with the idea that global capital destroys livelihood faster than it creates new ones, and that is creating, land becomes an important alternative within this space. So now, because it is interesting, and just to give you some sense of what I'm talking about, is that the largest occupation that I'm talking about is about 241 hectares, right? So it's quite a bizarre phenomena where you have urban residents occupying land, whether state or private land, and are doing urban agriculture and livestock, engaging in that forms where they have cattle, pigs, everything is there within that city space. Now, of course, I'm thinking about it through the lens of space, so that is already an example for me of how spaces can be reconfigured and what I call the agrarianization of urban space. So this idea about the urban and the rural having certain characteristics is being challenged from below. Because people are saying, why should we not have livestock agriculture in the city? Who has decided that the city has to look at a particular way? Who has imposed that idea of modernity, right? That even the state is saying we don't want agrarian type of activities in the city. At best, we will have one is like crop production in the form of urban agriculture. But people are challenging that idea and saying we have a house, we don't have a job. How else can we think about the reconfiguring of space? And I want to, so there are these twin processes that are going on, and to think about how the urban and the rural is blurred. When we think about slums and favelas and urban slums, we think of these and shanty towns as urban phenomena. But there's a twin process that is emerging in South Africa. What I would call, borrowing from other people's, the concept of the slumification of rural towns. So over the past decade, we had the emergence of rural slums, of particularly agricultural labor that is contained within these spaces, and these two dynamics is happening at the same time, right? So you see the movement of people to the cities, but also from rural to rural, rural to urban, and the same dynamic is how space is configured. So this idea of what the rural should look like and what the urban should look like is being challenged from below, and it's reconfiguring space and what I would characterized like a form of anti-neoliberal planning from below, right? That is sort of disrupting a lot of notions in the way in which one can think about this particular phenomenon. So one example you have is, where farm workers historically were living on farms. Post-apartheid, we had a massive form of eviction from farms. And people were then sort of pushed to the towns or to the urban areas. But over the past decade, because of the commodity production has been changed, where you have packing sheds, people are locked into space, they don't have to do seasonal migration, you had the emergence of spatial urban rural towns, or rural slums. But this became a very dynamic force because for the first time, because of rural slums, we had the biggest farm workers strike in 2012. Because now people are no more under the gaze of the white farmer, under the gaze of that oppressive machinery, even though one can think of this as, yeah, it's rural slums. But for me, it is more than rural slums because I, borrowing from Trevor Ngwane, we think about this as democracy at the margins. Because there people are governing themselves, they can interact and allow them to sort of engage in struggles that sort of shapes their own trajectory, right? So this is the first form of the politics of this repossession that I think of. But here is the thing, to come back to the question of race, because the danger of only thinking about blackness, the dynamic between black and white, we would fail to understand how capitalism is fracturing blackness too. And I will give you an example of farm workers. So within that spatial configuration, you have farm workers from Zimbabwe, South Africa, and that resulted in conflict, right? Where Zimbabwean black Zimbabwean workers were attacked by South African black workers because of the way in which commodity relations is structured. So it's important for us to take that dynamic into consideration when we think about how easy it is for whether we call it white supremacy or racial capitalism to do the fracturing internal into the black society, right? So I'm asking us to think about, and we have to think in our own context, how it fractures blackness within our own spaces. And there's different ways. In Africa, the easiest way is tribalism or regionalism, or where you come from, right? So this is just the first form that I can think about, the way in which we think about space, and the farm workers is a good example. However, this is the beauty of this dynamic process because it's a struggle. So the strike itself resolved this conflict among these people because they begin to understand what is the common denominator, is capitalist production, and the way in which white farmers sort of structures that relationship. Because the question is, why do white farmers have to rely on Zimbabweans when there is a pool of unemployed people locally, right? So they create this particular tension and friction because it is to depress wages even further of the local populace, and it creates this tension. Now, one way to think about how right-wing ideology will emerge itself in spaces like Africa, it is through this mechanism, right? Because now it creates this tension, the Zimbabweans have to go home, we don't want them in our space, and this is amongst Africans, this is amongst black people, right? So this idea, to think about the way in which right-wing ideology, it's not going to be the white supremacist that is going to, chase us at the Bastille, but it's going to be through this mechanism. Now, going back to the second form in which the rural-urban linkages is being sort of reconfigured is through what I think about the politics of repossession, but where the rural is sort of radicalizing the urban space, right? So the sites where I am doing my study, they were faced with by eviction by the state. The state has this anti-invasion unit, which basically renders, this is the second mode of dispossession that is happening under post-apartheid South Africa. And the state, the post-apartheid state, has a unit called the Anti-Land Invasion Unit, which tells indigenous people that they are illegal on their space, right? And this becomes the contestation about how people then frame their own struggles. So just to give you an example, when the rural, there was a movement called the Grand Reform for Food Sovereignty I was involved with. So when the rural people came, there was a sand mining company that was going to come and mine that place, and the rural people came there and they were puzzled to say, how do you allow this? It was the most amazing thing because the urban, even though they occupied the land, they were just standing their houses. And it was rural women who went to this mining company, confronted them, and sort of radicalized them. And so the urban people said, oh, that's possible. And so this idea that we have about rural people in some way, and someone made that point earlier as well, it's important to think about space and where struggles happen and who can radicalize who, right? And so it sort of displays this idea that the urban is the site of intellectual ideas and radicalism. In this context, it was completely the opposite. Although people sort of respond, and this game, for me, it sort of generated a new politics of indigeneity. So I told you earlier about this category of people who self-identified as colored, but under post-apartheid, they discovered, oh, we are the descendants of the Khoi and the San, and so now they are drawing on this new identity because of land business and redefining themselves as indigenous, right? So remember I said they are white, colored, white, Indian, colored, African. Now you have these two categories of indigeneity, Khoisan and blackness, right? And it is framed in this dual way in which one can think about it. So one of the leaders that would be, during apartheid, would be classified as colored, and phenotypically there's nothing African about him, but he's a descendant of the Khoi and the San. And in response to the state, he sort of asked this question: how can I be illegal in my own country? We are indigenous people of South Africa. They're doing the same thing that was done during apartheid years. So it's a new language of indigeneity that is emerging within the struggle. Because what the apartheid government did was to remove colors from Africans. To say you are something in between that is just hanging there, which this new form is in a sense a negation of the old classification scheme, but it is tied to land claims. Because now there is something else is also emerging within the space, which is when I talked about political blackness, because it's not a stable political project, right? It can fracture at particular historical moments within society, right? So I hope I am as clear as mud to think about the different forms, because this is a story that is unfolding within the urban space, which is quite fascinating to me, that you have a new configuration within the urban space where people sort of reinsert the politics of indigeneity. Just a side issue, Amazon came a few years ago to Cape Town to set up a distribution center. It was interesting, Amazon went then and said, we are negotiating with the Khoisan. And I was like, who is these people? We don't know that. And it's these new groups that have reclaimed their indigeneity and saying, we are the original owners of the land, right? Because there's an acceptance that the Khoi and the San are the oldest people of the continent, right? Of that space that precedes everyone else. But that is the logic of the Germans that have sort of created this division between there's a Bantu type and there's a Khoi type. But people draw on this history. So Amazon negotiated with these two groups, right? The one group rejected the development of Amazon, saying it's a violation of the sacred land. The other group accepted it, saying this is development. All drawing on this question of indigeneity, right? So it's a very fascinating process that is, for me at least, that is unfolding within the South African context, and how blackness is being fragmented under new capitalism, under new liberal apartheid, or under new liberal capitalism, in the way in which, in response to what Fred would call the logic of white supremacist capitalist relations, This is the response from below, to assert a new identity and reconfiguring urban space. And this is all happening in the urban space, right? So for me, here we are seeing a new configuration of what the urban is constituted of and how people are saying what is possible. So now you have these traditional indigenous people forming councils in the urban spaces, which is a very unusual phenomenon because that was restricted to rural areas, and are organizing people on this identity, right? And I would argue that this new politics of indigeneity has both emancipatory and a reactionary possibility. And I will come back to why I will say to that. Which leads me to the way in which South African society is fractured in the moment is through, which is different. Of course, I accept Marcelo's point about specificity, and this is one of the specificities in South Africa, which we have, because the state now, because of the struggles from below, the state has sort of accepted a new bill, which is called the Khoisan Traditional Bill, accepting these new identities without any territory, right? So the state is saying, yeah, you can be Khoisan, but you will not have land, like other tribal groups, right? And so now you have what I would call retribalization without territory, that is functioning both in urban spaces and in rural spaces. But these people have no mandate from anyone. They're just there emerging as a political force and asserting their new identity, right? For them, it's a rejection of the old apartheid label, and they're reinstituting a Khoisan identity, which might or might not be progressive. Which is interesting. This movement is driven by a Rastafarian movement in South Africa, which is another dynamic because they're supposed to be Pan-African and they're asserting something new. So this is the way in which one can think about the urban space and how it is being reconfigured through this notion and how it is fracturing blackness and political tensions. But what is interesting, this new identity is also pushing people to occupy land in the rural areas, particularly by these Khoisan groups to say that we are indigenous, and so it's spurring them to also address this land question. So the inability to address the land question is creating different temporal forms that always exist there. So this idea that this Khoisan identity is something new, for me, is to think about how temporal layers coexist within the city, and it's always there like a geological layer. It's always embedded within this space and will be activated at different historical periods, right? So it's not that there is something that they invented, that people understood they are descendants of this identity, but at a particular point, to would have reclaimed an identity was not beneficial to them during this historical period. So to move back to this idea that now the space, and to look at South Africa and how this politics of repossession is coming against a global racial order. So South Africa in 2018, through the economic freedom fighters, were proposing land expropriation without compensation. Very liberal and mild idea, even by the EFF, it was not radical. But here we see how this global demand, because they are thinking if South Africa resolves its problem and its location within the African continent, it has a huge political consequences. The same way Zimbabwe had the consequence for the South African population. So there was a split. I don't want to get sidetracked, I still have 1 hour. But I'm almost there. So when the Zimbabweans took the land from the settlers, Rhodesians, there was a split in South African society between white and black. But for the working class, they saw Mugabe as a hero, right? Not because they think he was great, but because the land was redistributed. And for them, that was the promise in which they think they would also have to think, right? And so white society, white liberals couldn't understand why the working class and why the landless people movement, people like Mangaliso, them, all of Mugabe as a hero. precisely because that's the question you have to resolve in settler colonial society. The ability to control and manage your own resources and to say how production is going to happen within that society. Of course, the Zimbabwean question is an ongoing question, is an incomplete, but the land question immediately broke the power relations of white settlers there. There's no doubt about it. Now the conflict is internal. It's not about settlers, whether they control land or not, but it's another dynamic that is emerging. Now, interesting enough, when South Africa was proposing, that they're going to do land expropriation without compensation, the white Afrikaner group, they immediately went to Trump and said there is white genocide emerging in South Africa on the promise that nothing happened, just the promise that South Africa is going to take the land back. And Trump responded to say that it has to happen within the rule of law, there's a white genocide. But it was not just Trump. Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, all responded because that was the signal to us that in the way in which, when the Zimbabweans resolved the land question, there were sanctions against them. There were punitive measures against them. So there's an order, when you call it a capitalist imperialism or racial capitalist imperialist order, that responds to the promise of insurgency from below. And it's always going to try and undermine it because it understands what is the implication if Zimbabwe is successful, because other oppressed groups will look up to that, right? So it's not about just undermining it and paying compensation, because they understand what is its significance globally. So just for us to understand how this new configuration is coming into question, so I want to conclude by saying, if we pay attention to this insurgent practices, there are two things that emerge for me. One is democracy from below. Two, people are reconfiguring our understanding of property relations and saying social property as opposed to individual property is a measure. But that does not mean, here is the thing, and for me I find it fascinating, they say, we will have social property, but that will not preclude individual property relations. But you will not have the ability to alienate it in the spaces that I study. So it's very fascinating because here there are no academics, there are no intellectuals, there were no NGOs that dictated to them. The NGOs came later, which is a way when you think about when people constitute themselves. The second important thing, people say, yeah, there are ethnic conflict. In that space, there are people who speak multiple languages, even someone from DRC Congo. So within their own spaces, people are able to mediate and find ways to overcome and reach the things that we think is virtually impossible. And they are giving us a space to think about how are they reconstituting new ways and forming new ways of building solidarity within the current conjuncture. To the 21st century, land struggles are remaking race and ethnicity and indigeneity in ways that are both inclusive and exclusionary, exposing a class of temporalities in both urban and rural spaces, right? And this globalized economic power structure threatens local agency, and it is equally disrupted by the agency from below. So we have to, when we think about how do we overcome the divisions internal to our own self through the lenses of insurgency, I think we will come to vastly different conclusions, right? And I want to end with the Haitian example, that in order to solve your problem, there is no way in which you cannot do it without the amount of violence in both directions. There is no, because at the moment, the violence is unidirectional, and there is no response, right? And I don't like the word violence. I think people have the right to self-defense, whatever means you think about it through their own organization, and to build a new way of thinking about solidarity across the spectrum. One of the failures of the Zimbabwean land reform is that although the movement gave support, there was no concrete solidarity with the Zimbabwean struggle, and to say, we are forcing the South African government to intervene. So we didn't form the solidarity. So the point is, if we believe that there's a global power structure that is shaping differentially our spaces in Colombia and Zimbabwe, Brazil and everywhere else, that means that there is a connecting point between our struggles, even if there is specificity, right? Because that for me is the way in which we have to reconfigure, because the nation state in a sense, and this is what Zimbabwe teaches me, becomes obsolete in terms of politically thinking. Because now, just to conclude, within that space, and even in South Africa, how do you think about if there's a Malawi in Zimbabwe? Why didn't they benefit from land reform? Why did agricultural laborers not benefit from land reform? And so what I'm suggesting is that we have to reconfigure our understanding of the agrarian question, that there is an urban dimension, but it's not just a peasant question, it's a labor question, it's a gender question, it's an ecological question. Because the question we are faced now is about the necessity of life and the ability for people to reproduce ourselves, which then we'll probably talk more about. But we have to find a way to think about how the politics of land repossession is reconfiguring and rendering the spatial categories obsolete, but creates a basis for us to engage in struggle to assert the sovereignty and self-determination. Thank you.
Pessoal, acho que dado o avançar agora, a gente abre para uma rodada de perguntas e eu faço a finalização depois apontando alguns cenários a partir da fala do Ricardo. Acho que assim fica bom.
We have another mic.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for your talk. Hi. Thank you very much. No, I just have two short questions. The first was when you were first beginning to talk, and you were talking about Haiti, and you were talking about Haiti, and you talked about Zimbabwe, and you said you were talking about the kind of reparations that Haiti had to pay, and then the compensation that Zimbabwe is forced to not be able to go to that, getting people that back, with punitive consequences. And you said these are contradictions we are living. And so I want to know what is meant by contradictions, and what contradictions are there? I mean, when I look at the demand by the French to, for example, pay reparations, I don't see that there's any contradictions with them. So I just want to know what contradictions means there. And then at the very end, again, coming back to Haiti and Zimbabwe, you were talking about, well, you were first talking about Haiti. And then like we start talking about people. So you were talking about Haiti, really having the right to defend itself, and then you said people have the right to defend themselves, and I think you said by any means. And so I want to know if you have a qualification on that. For example, do you think that white settler oppressive hegemons have the right to defend themselves by any means possible when they feel like they're being attacked? So,
Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada, Ricardo, pela sua excelente palestra, muito instigante. E eu teria uma pergunta mais conteúdo teórico. Eu acho que os seus exemplos empíricos nos levam a nos certificarmos da impossibilidade de mantermos as categorias rurais, rural e urbano, como categorias de classificação, seja de espaço, seja de relações sociais. Quando você fala das cidades rurais, eu não entendi direito o que elas significam, qual é o conteúdo dessa classificação. Eu queria, então, perguntar a você se haveria, se estaria em processo uma discussão que levaria a uma nova ou uma classificação alternativa para esquecermos, né, dessa dualidade rural e urbana e entendermos os processos de relações independentes de uma caracterização rígida, como a que se faz normalmente o rural como sinônimo de agrícola. Então, eu gostaria de saber como se dá esse debate na África do Sul e qual as contribuições, né, que essa realidade que você nos trouxe nos leva a pensar teoricamente.
Thank you, Ricardo. First of all, I'm very pleased and happy to see that your articulation today also about anti-blackness and blackness in a way that you help us to think also about this supposed exceptionalism of Brazil. And I appreciate this critique. However, I think there are some points there that we perhaps find ways to accommodate these differences into different societies. First of all, I think this idea of tribalization without land, I think this is a history of Latin America in the last, I would say, 30 years, more or less, in which most of Latin American countries adopted multicultural constitutions and cultural recognition of difference of indigenous groups. Black people in many parts of Latin America had to incorporate a particular form of indigeneity to make claims as quilombolas, as parentes, as garífunas, as particular group of the people that would have to prove the connection to the land in a form of indigeneity, in the native land. So in this way, this cultural recognition came at a high cost for many people, was a granting of rights and denying of life. So granting rights and denying life. At the same time that was title of land for some of the people, of course not all, most of it, despite this struggle continue. There is also all this development project, all this that came also with this. So this tribalization without land in Latin America happened as well as people having to incorporate particular forms of identity to make themselves legible to the state was a need for them. In the urban front, Ricardo, I think that's where it's absolutely fantastic to see these connections with South Africa. I think we have a other set of problems. One is Black people have always organized in the urban land, but not always embrace blackness or embrace race. Most of the struggle for surviving the urban front has actually been without any racial ground. People organize around the transportation, public transportation, among the land, occupation of the land, among, I don't know, all forms of the rights that the people have to embrace to make themselves legible in a context in which we, perhaps contrary to South America, we are still struggling to make race a valid category to make claims of urban citizenship. So it's a very hard struggle for all of us. And in that sense, perhaps anti-blackness makes sense in that I appreciate the zero point about opening the possibility of coalition that incorporates blackness as an expansive category. At the same time, particularly for activist scholars in this area, it's hard for us because anti-blackness as a concept is one also to say that, hey, even though in the urban front we fight around material needs, transportation, again, housing, all these, in the urban front there is a pervasive, a diffusive form of racism against the Black people, even among the poor, even in the favela, even in the community. How do we combine both? Your call for not to get lost into this fragmentation of blackness that is ruling urban capitalism. At the same time, how do we attend to the urgent call of making also legible the specificity of the Black people in the urban planning. And to conclude, I really appreciate your conversation here. Tomorrow I also will bring here to read Colombia and the people of this. We hope should be in the same not yesterday. But I appreciate this, but I would like to see your points about violence there. Because in the urban context again, what I see is this principle of the Haitian Revolution being applied, but in a form of outlawed violence, gang violence, for example. So I think the invitation to think with you here how we can think about hate in two ways. Hate as a method of analysis of this urban condition, but also the racialization of people in the context of widespread vulnerability of people based in the same vulnerability that Haitian people have as a global power of the world.
Ricardo, thank you. I can't help but I need to ask you about the following elections and how do you see in the near horizon the expectations for what you call democracy from below, since as in Brazil, and Eunice has talked about our lack of hope in Brazil in the sense that we don't see many alternatives to the Workers' Party, and what is the opposition is even worse. But in South Africa, you had recently the emergence of the NK within ANC, and I really don't know what are the prospects for what is happening, what has been happening in South Africa in terms of this recognition of Aboriginal, I've heard this term, Aboriginal people. So if you could tell, I know you are not a fortune teller, but please.
I will throw my votes. Thank you very much. These are very tough questions. Right, they want me to eat the mic.
Yes. Otherwise they can translate.
We don't offer lunch today. That's just the line.
White supremacy, they always want us to do politics. Well, this is precisely my point, that we are operating with classification schemes that are out of sync with objective reality. And so I'm not suggesting, I don't have a new grammar, and I think that I want us to, it's my invitation for us to develop the grammar that explains these changes that are happening from below, because we think of these as structures. And precisely for me is to think about not just the new grammar, but what people are demanding of how space could be. Because they're also putting that on the agenda to say, why are you precluding space? Why can't space not be organized in this way? Why can't we have urban centers look like, why can't we have agriculture in urban space? Who decided that, right? And so for me, that's the one theoretical point that I think one has to think about. For me, I'm stuck on the grammar and to think about where does this lead ourselves. My own intervention is through the lens of the agrarian question. And I'm arguing that there's an urban dimension of the agrarian question, which is not thought of. And I'm saying, if we don't expand the theoretical basis of thinking about the agrarian question as both an urban and a rural question, and define what it means through the insurgents that I am working with, because they have two demands, housing and land for agricultural livelihoods. And there is a sense in which in academia, there is ways in which when you talk about housing, no, that's not agrarian. But, or if you talk about the rural, it's agriculture, right? But that is not how people are reconfiguring space and what they are truly doing with space. Because in both the agricultural workers, there are two dynamics. Some want land and someone just want housing and someone better incorporation into the space. and they want this space to be humane spaces for them. So there's this two dynamic, and for me, more and more when I listen to earlier today and from my own research, I really think this understanding, at least we have to start with how do we define what is urban, right? And therefore I have this uncomfortableness with people like in the US, like Neil Brenner, with this planetary urbanization, the way in which they sort of speak about it. I find it difficult to think about. I understand it's the logic of accumulation, but that's not how space is reconfigured, right? So to in a sense, I'm saying I'm also grappling with this question to think about what would be the analytical horizons if we accept what would be that new category, right? Because we've been trapped in thinking about space, but it's not we've been trapped in space because this is also the legacy of modernization here, the way in which we think about space, right? And in a sense, we have to destroy these categories, and I don't have any better alternative to offer you other than to explain the process of what I characterize as the reorganization of urban space, and these two dynamics that are going on simultaneously, which people think are incompatible and in conflict with each other, because there's a demand for housing and there's a demand for land for agriculture. And I don't think the two are necessarily in conflict. I mean, yes, of course, I always agree with Janine, yes. The contradictions when I talk about is because I think the Zimbabwean land occupation movement was incomplete because they created, because this was not a state project. I don't believe in that. It was an insurgency from below, and then it spread without coordination. I agree with that analysis that people started in a space, but the struggle was dictated by necessity, right? And then it spread. The state intervenes to structure this whole land reform process in a way that they can control it. Now, what I'm saying about the contradiction is that the people have the insurgents uprising and saying, we don't care about compensation, right? The state is negotiating and saying, yeah, what we can do. So there's this contradictory thing where people are asserting sovereignty, the state is being subjected because of economic sanctions, and maybe might consider paying compensation. So there's a tension between what happened from below and what this neoliberal state might do or might not do, depending on what is possible from below. So again, it's an example of, I don't necessarily agree with this idea of the radicalization of the state, because I think that was just a transient moment to take control, and all of that radicalization collapsed. That's the only slight difference I have with our brother Paris and Sam about the radical. I agree with Issa Sirji, who also sort of point out this. Because if it wasn't truly a radicalized state, this insurgency from below should have had the self-governing territory, but also should have destroyed the state and created something new, right? Now, in terms of violence, I don't think any secular colonial society has any right to violence. Because here's the thing, the Zimbabweans went to the landowners and said, can we share land? They didn't go and say, we want to take it, they say, could we share? And they refused. So there is an understanding that people from below, they don't think this. There's an imagination of settlers that black people want to kill them all. But the Zimbabwean land occupation was very rational. They knocked and said, can we share? You have 200 hectares. Give us some, you have some. They refused, so that triggered the conflict. In fact, there are still some settler farms. I don't know if we can characterize them settlers after the new configuration, but they're still white with farms in Zimbabwe. So there is this thing in our imagination when we think about it that it sort of feeds into the inhumanity of black people. There's this violent hordes that will come and slaughter. But even in South Africa, the demand is the same. Share the land. We can all coexist. There is no idea that white people should be chased into the sea. Of course, there's a category of people who think that, but I think there is a way in which people are thinking, but that refusal and the exertion of violence, I'm saying people should have the right to defend themselves. And the struggles teach me that's not people's first starting point. And Haiti also teach me that, like the rebellion and how do you defend yourself. It's like there is an expectation in settler colonial society that it's like in the US, you shouldn't fight back, you should be shot and then claim something. Right, you should allow yourself to be beaten to death and then use some legal mechanism. No, we cannot do that, right? So I'm saying in that sense, we have to defend ourselves. So that was, I don't want to go too long, it's interesting because it also had the guerrilla warfare, right? And it tapped into that knowledge. Because they could have just reproduced that same guerrilla warfare because it was the same people with the knowledge, but they did not pursue it because they wanted to draw a larger mass into this struggle, right? And so, for me, I think we shouldn't abandon the idea that people have the right to defend themselves, right? In whatever way, whether you bring the country to a standstill or just physically defend yourself, I think we should put that in the option. Otherwise, we are discussing this mass slaughter in a unidirectional manner, right? And we will do the statistics and we will publish that there are 6 million Black Brazilian youth killed, and that would be the unidirectional way which we think about it. I wholeheartedly agree with Jeremy. My point about emphasizing Biko, I have a lot of criticism against Biko, but that was a historical period. The point for me is that I want to re-emphasize that blackness, the lowest denominator, must become a political force on which you organize yourself. But it shouldn't end just with I'm black and I'm proud and and wearing African attire, that's important. But it has to consider in the ways in which either through territorial sovereignty or struggle for some form of municipal or state power. There is no way we have to think about politically how we're going to reconfigure society. Because I'm afraid even within the current environment, all of that can be undermined. And this is the fragility of the Zimbabwean question, where people can be dispossessed again by another layer if you don't think about politics in a broader sense, right? And I think that is the one way one can do both, making blackness legible, but also saying we need organization to think about politics and power, right? To at least, I think the thing that disrupts this notion that reminds societies that they are settler colonial societies is the resistance, right? Without the resistance, the society would become normalized. The US is the same. Without indigenous people reminding and resisting to say, remind us this is a settler colonial society. Not as a historical artifact, but as the present, right? And we have to think about it not as a way of appeasing anyone, but to assert it, because I'm again using the Haitian experience of asserting a black nation to have universal emancipation, right? And that is what we have to give the world. I had an argument with a white person in San Francisco. I was sharing with Lynn and Janine, and my question to him was, you know, if you discover humanity, you will enjoy it. And that is what I understand the Haitians are telling us, right? To establish a new humanity through blackness, but blackness also dies in the process. Thank you. Did I miss a question? Oh, elections. Oh, now it's the crystal ball. My prediction is the ANC will still be victorious. They might lose some urban centers because there is no real alternative. I don't think the economic freedom fighters have presented themselves as an alternative to the ANC. They all emerge from a singular source, and they all tap into that particular ideology about the Freedom Charter, and the ANC deviated from that. But my big worry is the the reconfiguration of tribalism in politics and the assertion of that as the primary way of organizing politics in South African society. So this idea of what I'm afraid of, because of the ways in which society is going, again, to come back to Haitian, but not the historical Haiti, contemporary Haiti, where the lumpen element would be able to govern society based on the way in which politics is unfolding within South Africa. Because it's a very violent process emerging in politics. Internally to organizations in KwaZulu-Natal, people are killing each other, they are fragmenting each other. And I think it allows for this lumpen proletariat, not as a radical force, but as a force that can sort of, keep a lid on society. And we have exactly, I'm from Cape Town. To do organizing in Cape Town is extremely difficult because of gangs. And you have to mediate these two centers of power, the violence from the state, the violence from below. And there was one historical moment where we could contain everyone, which is when there was a mass mobilization of society that we could contain gangs and we could control our own neighborhoods, and they were subdued. They didn't disappear, but I remember in the 1980s as a high school activist, we could go on and tell gangs we don't want any trouble, because we had a mass base behind us that could fight against them if it was necessary. So I'm saying there is ways in which we have to deal with specificity, but I think we can learn, like I said the other day, from the cumulative history of Black radical resistance, so that we don't fall into ways. We don't have to reproduce things that the Americans went through or the Africans went through. You don't have to go through that. You can draw lessons and think about how do we do politics based on that cumulative knowledge and apply it to the specific context in which we find ourselves. Tough questions, and I haven't answered all of it yet.
Thank you very much. Eu vou só oferecer, para a gente encerrar, todo mundo com fome, as caixas estão ficando cada vez mais diminuídas, mas eu queria oferecer em 5 minutos alguns pontos para a gente pensar, assim, sobretudo a partir da apresentação do Ricardo e da agrarização do mundo urbano, mas para rapidamente oferecer análises que podem em caminhos próximos ou não. E aí eu estou como campo empírico as pesquisas que eu tenho feito com quebradeiras de coco-babaçu. E aí vou oferecer um primeiro cenário. O primeiro são quebradeiras de coco-babaçu que ocupam periferias de cidades que precisam fazer longas caminhadas para acessar os seus babaçuais, acessar as palmeiras com as quais elas trabalham. A gente sabe que quebradeiras de coco-babaçu gira em torno, é um modo de vida relacionado com uma condição de trabalho. Esse é o primeiro cenário. Por outro lado, a gente tem um conjunto de quebradeiras de coco-babaçu, sobretudo quebradeiras de coco-babaçu negras, que têm investido em formas de aliança com outros povos e comunidades tradicionais, para lidar com uma questão que não seria mais uma questão de terra, mas como às vezes você tem falado, uma questão de território. E aí, tem vínculos de solidariedade, sobretudo assentadas na ideia de território, consequentemente de ocupação, de retomada territorial. São duas cenas para pensar os mesmos sujeitos e como eles lidam com a questão fundamental, que é da terra, reconfigurando isso para território. E uma terceira cena, só para a gente imaginar uma outra questão, um campo que eu fiz em 2019 com Rosa Gregória, que me ajudou a pensar. Numa das marchas das Margaridas, em 2018, na verdade, a gente teve uma mobilização massiva, multirracial, com a delegação maranhense sendo a maior delegação da marcha naquele momento. Ônibus lotados. E a fala da Rosa era muito esperada, sobretudo porque naquele momento se tinha no governo do Flávio Dino uma série de expectativas narrativa sobre o comunismo desenvolvido no Maranhão. E para minha surpresa, né, ao ver Rosa falando, a gente via a cara das pessoas ao redor em completa desaprovação. E aí Rosa me ensinou uma coisa que, para se pegar, ninguém solta, para não se soltar a mão de ninguém, precisa primeiro ter tentado pegar. E naquele momento ela chamava muito a atenção para as violências cometidas pelo Estado do Maranhão contra povos e comunidades tradicionais, em especial a construção de um porto, que na época era um porto para conduzir e ampliar a exportação do agronegócio, mas também das violências sucessivas que têm ocorrido em Alcântara. Então, o que eu acho que é fundamental para a gente pensar a partir da fala do Ricardo, das interpelações que a gente tem tido aqui, são formas de solidariedade pragmáticas, concretas, que ofereçam os seus corpos como forma de resistência. Gira um pouco em torno disso o que eu gostaria de oferecer para vocês agora, e foi um pouco isso.